Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to day two of a weekend with good friends and their fantastic panel discussions. This time I will be in front of the cameras and questioning our dear Scott Dorward and Graham Patrick directly, instead of being in the void behind, to the topic of the uncanny valley and Lovecraftian horror. Um, Before we begin, I would ask both of you to give just a brief introduction for those who might not have heard of you and what you do and maybe how to reach you at the beginning. Graham, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I'm Graeme Patrick. I've written several scenarios. Some were published, some weren't. I hang around on It's Slade Nobody, doing some writing for them and some audio dramas as well. And I can be found on RPG Nook as well. Easy to find in most Discords. I'm usually lurking somewhere.
Fantastic. And Scott?
Hi, I'm Scott Dorward. I'm one of the co-hosts of the Good Friends of Jackson Liars, and I appear on a number of actual play podcasts, including Ain't Slade Nobody, How We Roll, and Grizzly Peaks Radio. Written a bit of stuff for Call of Cthulhu. Oh, gosh, I can't speak this morning. Written a bit of stuff for Call of Cthulhu and a few other horror RPGs. And yeah, you can find me on the Good Friends Discord very easily, or if you want to find out about some of the stuff I do, take a look at blasphemoustomes.com.
Fantastic. And good morning, good evening, and good every day to all the viewers watching us live. If you have any questions throughout the panel, please post them at underneath our YouTube, and we'll try to get to them as much as we can if we get not too much distracted in our conversation, but we'll do our best. And starting with the Uncanny Valley, the concept by Mashiro Mori, that he termed initially Bukimi no Tani, that kind of translates into the Uncanny Valley. As an icebreaker, could you both give your definition of what you understand of it and what a good example of Uncanny Valley is from media that you really like?
Do you want to start, Scott, or do you want me to?
I'm very happy for you to start if you got something lined up.
Uncanny Valley for me is basically getting close enough to being human or looking familiar with a slight missing element which makes people wary or put it on ease, to the point where they see you as threatening, or they're not quite sure why they're uncomfortable around you, but there's a certain thing that's wrong. Media wise, pull out probably an old film. It's like, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Have you seen that one? It's got lots of uncanny valleys where he's trying to remember what his life was like and trying to unravel why he's missing certain things. You'll see a lot of the uncanny people and that are slightly erased from his memory, all around the film, sort of thing. It can be quite disturbing, I suppose.
Yeah, my definition, or my understanding of it is very similar to yours. I think it's more than just seeing things as a threat because they're slightly off. It's seeing them as somehow wrong, which may also trigger responses to do with disease and death and so on. That you're seeing perhaps someone that appears to be alive and functioning as alive, as at the same time there are aspects of them that just seem to be dead or wrong, that creep you out rather than necessarily provide that predator response. One example from media, which may be a very non-obvious one, but it occurred to me afterwards that this film triggered the hell out of my uncanny response, is a film from a few years back called Killing of a Sacred Deer. And there's nothing in the plot of the film that's really about that. It's sort of a very weird revenge story, but it's the way it's made. It's the only Yorgos Lanthimos film I've seen. I need to catch up with more of his work, and I don't know if all of his films are like this. But the performances in it are very stylized in a way that the emotional responses are all slightly at odds with the lines that are being delivered, in a way that it feels slightly inhuman. And so even there are a lot of creepy situations in the film, but even the most mundane situations and interactions feel wrong and creepy just because the delivery is stilted or has the wrong emotional tone to it. And the overwhelming effect in a feature film becomes it almost made me panic watching that film. It just felt so wrong.
Make Ludge jealous.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm surprised you didn't pick a Lynch film like Mulholland Drive or something, actually.
Yeah. I mean, Lynch certainly uses that technique a lot as well, but I've never seen it captured quite as purely as in that film.
Nice.
Yeah, maybe just for the viewers who haven't heard or the origin of Uncanny Valley, as I said, it's from Mashiro Mori, a scientist in computer and robotics. And what he tried to do is explain the relationship between human likeness and the affinity towards kind of robots. And so if you plot the human likeness of a robot against the affinity of humans perceiving those, you'll see that the more human-like they get, the more we like them. But only up to a certain point, when exactly at that point it becomes uncanny, it becomes weird. And then suddenly the affinity drops quite significantly. But then, if you pass that point and you become Westworld type of robots, when you can't distinguish anymore really any features that would make them seem weird or strange, but their behavior, the graph rapidly goes up again and kind of tries to catch up and exceeds the plot. And this little dip kind of in this graph is the uncanny valley that he termed. So it's this disappearance of, or the increase in, well, in that case, the decrease of affinity towards robots at the specific level of not quite human yet, but also more than a simple like toy robot or something.
Does the study go into whether that's an initial reaction? The reason I ask is I was watching a video unrelated to this the other day where they were talking about the problem of bomb disposal experts developing affinity and empathy for their robots. And these aren't humanoid robots, these are like little boxes on wheels with robotic arms, to the extent where they were actually making mistakes or doing suboptimal things in trying to defuse bombs because they didn't want to hurt their robots. They'd come to see them as living beings. And I guess if you see that robot on wheels in the first place, and yes, you're not going to look at it and think, oh yeah, that's cute or that's a person or whatever. But as you build up affinity over time with it, the fact that it doesn't look human doesn't matter. You still see it as like your friend.
It's not even robots. It's humans have a very pervasive thing of personifying anything that's around them that's familiar. Even things that get attached to it immediately, like you're going about the disposal unit, the Mars rover that everyone just kept on like cheering for because it's chugging along. It's way past its expiry date, and then there's the sort of famous last line that what was it? My battery is low. My battery is low, and it's getting dark. Was its last communication, and everyone like this poignant thing. Even I think it was fake. I'm not sure if it was true or not. But that's the big myth of that sort of the death of that robot. And it was globally mourned. This thing, it's quite a poetic sort of like triumph of this small little rover to do all these magical things. And I think it's more to do not the fact it's a robot, it's to do with imitation. It's like people don't like to be copied by things which they don't see as themselves or like part of their tribe almost. It's maybe an innate sort of more sort of primal thing in us than that.
There was a jokey internet post I saw a long time ago. I can't credit it because I can't remember who posted it, but it was someone talking about the uncanny valley response in humans, indicating that at some point in our history we evolved to recognize something that was trying to look like us but was getting it slightly wrong,
Yeah.
and seeing it as a threat,
Yeah.
which, from a horror point of view, is a really, really good idea. I think the conversation went on to all sorts of fairy legends and myths and so on. But yes, it's that idea that our history is somehow wrapped up with something that is like us, but not.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it could be Neanderthals and that sort of. There have been other sort of species of humans around, and maybe it was to do with keeping that sort of like divide between the cultures and not crossbreeding. Who knows? It's I mean, we're not really. We're pretty complicated people. Really, when it comes back down to it. Go sorry.
I don't know, but I was just going to say, but considering the number of people who apparently have Neanderthal DNA,
Yeah.
I mean, I guess that ties in with the modern cultural thing of monster fucking, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's these sneaky bastards that go past the sensors, I guess. Yeah, it's like again, we personify lots of things that we probably are not meant to. We sort of put on colourful characters to these things, so it depends how charming you are, I guess. That's what.
I mean, yeah, there are obviously a lot of interpretation about humans understanding their mortality, seeing this kind of like just in between thing, getting frightened of this, as well as mate selection, pathogen invulnerability, basically seeing that a figure can be completely resistant to anything. There are more physical and philosophical interpretations of how this is interpreted. But before we steer too off into that direction and maybe circle back later on it, I wanted to bring it to the Lovecraftian aspect and ask you, what is your a good example of your past maybe experience or reading where you encountered or used uncanny valley in your Lovecraftian horrors?
Well, the one that influenced me or got me thinking most about this is The Whisper in Darkness, Lovecraft, where you have this conversation that's going on between this man, Wilmarth, who's gone to visit this person he's been corresponding with but never met before, Henry Akeley, living in this remote farmhouse in Vermont. And they end up having this long conversation together in a darkened living room where Akeley is sitting in a chair and he's surprisingly still. There's something a bit weird about his voice. And they have this conversation that goes into very strange and upsetting areas for Wilmarth. But eventually Wilmarth goes up to his room and other stuff happens, but the following morning he comes back down and he finds sitting in the chair where Akeley was this wax mask and these two wax hands. And the implication obviously there is that there was something pretending to be Akeley sitting there that had disguised itself. And that to me is a very creepy image, because you can just sort of imagine the low light offering some degree of concealment to the fact that this is a mask, but you'd still perhaps pick up on things like the immobility of his face, and it's described a few times how his hands are just sitting there in his lap. He doesn't talk with his hands like most people do, and that sort of growing sense of wrongness from all these various cues that are telling you something's wrong. If you were in that situation, it probably wouldn't occur to you, first of all, that this is something that is sitting there with a mask on and false hands. But you'd pick up on these feelings of wrongness, and they'd be setting off alarm bells. And the way Lovecraft portrays that in the story, I think, is very, very effective. And certainly when I've tried to use similar things in Lovecraftian games, that's very much the image that I go back to, that those maybe not even that subtle cues that whatever it is you're speaking to here may superficially appear human, but it's not, and you really know it's not.
Yeah. Lovecraft tends to use a lot of uncanny valley in a lot of his work, and mainly, I think, I guess there was a lot of like science-based thinking in his work as well. Sort of like the sort of had a lot of race on his mind, I guess, and these sort of things. Unfortunately, but his fear served him quite well with sort of tapping into that sort of area. I mean, there's even more obvious things like Brown Jenkin as well, the sort of rat-faced sort of, well, the human-faced rat sort of thing that makes you very disturbing pictures of that sort of thing in your mind, sort of crossing these things, and puts a lot of like, well, I'm trying to say, tries to sort of like tie in these sort of fears that you could be abnormal, and there's a lot of abnormality into the sort of like world that's around you. You can't see that it's all around you, but you can't quite see it most of the time.
Grand Owl just said that even some prosthetics can kind of elicit that response of fear and subtleness. And I think that's also kind of important to consider 1920s after World War One, where a lot of soldiers lost their eyes. They had to have prostheses that were not really as we have them nowadays, but, well, quite uncanny in some situations. Made just humanesque enough, but then at the same time, if you just see it in the wrong light, it can create quite a bit of fear and terror, I would even say. And having to consider how many soldiers have lost body parts and in that time, I think, I often forget sometimes when I put scenarios like at the very early 1920s that there is still this after-war imagery that I usually try to ignore, because that would imply that the real world kind of seeps in too much in my escapism gaming. But I think it can be used and utilized quite well if you imagine that. Okay, so busy street, you come to City Hall unemployment office and you see the line of soldiers with prostheses and face mask. I think that's maybe in between. There's Amigo hiding away, getting his job on Earth.
Well, I was going to mention like not even the war, it's like just industry as standard going back in the day. It's like very dangerous working in factories and these sort of things. And a lot of like workplace industries with machines as well. Would see the workforce be lose a lot of fingers at least with these sort of things. I know I used to work in a factory a little bit, and there was always a lot of dangerous things that sort of, if you weren't paying attention, they would just get you, and then you see that consequence. But yeah, so if you go back in time to the sort of the start of the industrial era as well, it's like you have the chemicals that are a problem in the factory too, deforming, and everyone knows about the matchsticks and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and fuzzy jaw.
Yeah.
I wrote a scenario some time back that involved that, and exposure to phosphorus vapor would create this condition called fuzzy jaw, where you'd end up with your jawbone rotting away, and some of the girls, because it did tend to be young girls working in the factory, would just have to have their jaws amputated, their lower jaws amputated, which is
sounds horrific.
Yeah.
Radium Girls, good book.
Yeah. So it's like you have a lot of these things, and going back in, I mean, I think probably even up until the 70s or 80s, when safety wasn't really too much thought about. Until then, so you have a lot of these people in the industry have a lot of sort of like injuries or sort of like effects from the sort of factories and stuff that they're in, for sure.
But that's an interesting aspect of this whole thing, where you've got creatures. I mean, we talked very much about sort of the Migo. Not that it necessarily is a Migo in The Whisper in Darkness. There's hints that it might be Nyarlathotep, but you've got something that's using prostheses to disguise itself as human, and that's something you see in various Lovecraftian horror stories and scenarios. This use of things like prosthetics to allow entities that aren't human to pass amongst us, using the same techniques that people who have real disabilities and illnesses use to help them through life. And that's, I think, quite an uncomfortable thing when it comes up in games and fiction, in that I think it carries a certain risk of othering with people with disabilities, but also that reminder that the things that are frightening us or disgusting us about these things are things that we perhaps inherently sometimes feel towards people, other people when we encounter them, which isn't a very nice thing to think about. And I guess it is from the point of view it reminds us to challenge them. But when you see it portrayed in horror, the example I keep going back to for this is Michael Shea's story Fat Face, and this is a fantastic story. We did an episode of The Good Friends of Jackson Elias about it a while back, and if you're interested in it, I mean, obviously check that out for more thoughts on the subject. But Fat Face introduces these monsters, which you see in Call of Cthulhu, called Shoggoth Lords. And Shoggoth Lords are like smaller versions of Shoggoths that adopt human guise. But there's certain things they're not very good at. I mean, they don't grow hair for a start, so they're completely hairless. Because of the mass that they're trying to put into their human form, they tend to look very overweight or obese. And they use prosthetics to try to maintain their human form. They use they use trusses and careful costumes to actually hold their human shapes in, and orthopedic shoes to give their feet a human shape and allow them to walk. And so the overall effect, when you see an entire group of entities like this, which you do in the story, they sort of come together for meetings every now and then. There's this whole group of people who have got the same apparent disabilities. And it's, I mean, through the eyes of the other human characters in the stories, there's a sort of sense of empathy for them, first of all, because it's here are these people who are trying to deal with obviously some fairly unfortunate things in their lives, but also that sort of sense of weirdness and the uncanny valley thing of there's all these people who all look wrong in slightly the same way, who are together, Is there some other reason for that? And in the story, there very much is, and it's a very sinister reason. And yeah, I mean that if you sort of map it onto daily life, I think it is quite an unfortunate response.
Yeah, it can be difficult to like put a wedge between the two groups of something being sinister and something being unfortunate sort of circumstance sort of thing. Um, we have like quite a few schools around the place that have special needs kids in my area, and it's like we're always like quite wary of how outsiders will come into the area and treat them, sort of thing. It's one of those things that 'cause a lot of the families live on the street and all that sort of thing. So there's a lot of sort of like almost pent up angst about outsiders coming into that sort of situation. So you tend to form little tribes that sort of like are guarded almost, and even that can be something which can cause conflict because you can become very sensitive to it, and some offhand comment which wasn't meant to be something which is a slight could be seen as a slight, and you get into these sort of like very sort of like standoffish and sort of like communications sort of thing. So yeah, it's difficult to go down that route and say something is sinister when it can be portrayed as sort of just as you said before, ableism. So it's a very narrow path to walk, but I think you just have to be upfront with it and have the sinister aspect become more of a wondrous thing, and to take it away from that the more human aspect. So your uncanny can break the wall of what human is. So it has that you're saying about being trussed up into costumes, for example. It's not a very human thing to do. So you maybe focus on that aspect of it to separate the two groups, sort of thing, and you go down that route. But yeah, it's a very difficult thing to separate, I guess.
I guess that leads me to maybe a question related to that. When you utilize such events, or you would create entities that would mimic human-like things, do you have any suggestions or ideas how to design specifically clues for the investigators or the revelation process of that entity to maintain kind of that uncanny valley until the climax of revelation? Do you have any suggestions or ideas of how to subtly incorporate this?
Well, there's quite a good canon one within Call of Cthulhu, which is with serpent people. There's a spell called Consume Likeness, which serpent people and ghouls in Call of Cthulhu can use, where they can steal someone's form basically by eating them. And there are tells in the game. And the big one is that the shadow they cast will always be the shadow of their original form. And certainly when we were doing the two-headed serpent and we had a mild spoiler, but it's not a huge spoiler because I think the title indicates some of what's going on. We had serpent people in there, some of whom were taking on human guises through a variety of means. There were different tells that we tried putting in that. Certainly there was the classic consume likeness, but there were all sorts of other ways in which different groups of serpent people with access to different magic and different technology would try to take on human guises, and sometimes through genetic engineering, sometimes through really simple means like using magic to skin someone and then just wearing their skin. And these obviously all had different ways where, depending on the environment in which player characters would meet them, they might sort of see things like, the skin doesn't quite fit the bone structure and stuff like that, and which is a big one. Or it could just be, catching someone off guard who otherwise appears to be completely human, and you see them in an unguarded moment blinking with a nictitating membrane across their eye, something like that. Just these sometimes quite blatant, sometimes quite subtle ways of saying this is something pretending to be human.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, there's a lot you can do with that.
And there's goodwill to mask that as well. If someone's being quite affable and friendly, and they have that aspect which is the wondrous horror rather than more realistic, you can mask it with whether they did or did not see it. Maybe they were like delusional at the time, or maybe they just sort of blink and you miss it sort of moment, and then you have the person be like their personality should just override that uncanniness and keep them like engaged on a more human level. If you have some like sort of hiding, being a human, and they're friendly and even helpful, the players will probably go along with it for a long time before they start to think, well, maybe this guy's a problem, sort of thing.
And they don't even have to be a problem necessarily.
No, definitely not.
So, I mean, one of the classics in Call of Cthulhu and Lovecraft himself for potentially triggering that uncanny valley response is the Yithians. So you've got these alien creatures who live in Earth's distant past, who project their consciousness through time and possess people, swap minds with them. And we don't encounter one directly in The Shadow Out of Time, but we're told a little bit about what happened when someone was possessed by one and he was piecing things together. And there was that initial adjustment period where the Yithian was sort of learning how to be human, how to pretend to be human. And even after that, there are always going to be little things like the mannerisms and the way it projects emotions and that are just going to seem slightly wrong, particularly if you know the person. And those are going to trigger all sorts of responses. But the Yithians in the story, and certainly in other portrayals in other stories, aren't necessarily malevolent. What they do is horrible, and you wouldn't want it done to you. But they're archivists, they're entities who are driven by intellectual curiosity, who are going out and learning more about the scope of history. Maybe they've got schemes sometimes, or maybe they are just driven by intellectual curiosity. And there are certainly stories like I can't remember what it's called, but there's a story by Adrian Tchaikovsky in The Private Life of Elder Things, where someone encounters someone who's been possessed by Yithian and they actually become friends. I mean, it's still a bit upsetting in places, but it's that sort of weirdness, that offness of this alien entity trying to play it being human, just ends up being something that that isn't necessarily horrific in the story. It's just what the entity is. And similarly in Ruth Ann Emrys's Wintertide, there's a Yithian character in that who very much again is there just gathering information, being an archivist who is revered by the Deep Ones because they are this perhaps even protector of Deep One history, telling them about their own past. And the character is very off. She's an academic. I can't remember either a physicist or a mathematician. And she, in her mannerisms and so on, seems to be quite alien. But on the other hand, because she is an academic and because she is a mathematician, I think a lot of people just read her as being neurodivergent and just accept all these tics and weirdnesses. She's just an eccentric mathematician, which kind of works.
Yeah, quite like that as well. I mean, you can have vampires hiding like that as well. It's like you have that sort of arcanic idea that they're out of time, in more traditional horror as well. Sort of you have them sort of ticks that they don't really quite understand what's around them. Yeah, I like the Yithians are very interesting. There's not a lot of scenarios that are written with Yithians, I don't think, is there?
There are a few, but yeah, but not as many as you might like. Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting one.
I actually have been. I'm running currently Fungi from Yoggoth, the older
Oh,
versions,
yeah.
and there's actually one of the pre-scenarios, kind of the introductory scenarios, where Yithians are being used in a setting, and they infiltrate. They're just there by accident, but they get curious about the investigator doing something else, and so it's a fitting kind of, or it's a nice twist about it that there are other entities amongst you. It was quite interesting, especially like once my players then kind of finished that scenario and the Yithian left the body again. That motion of I need to walk differently, and the body suddenly behaved completely different, non-human like, and they had this discussion about, well, is that now the alien, or was the alien the one before? Was he just evil? And it was a nice moral dilemma that led to a nice conclusion, I think.
Yeah, sorry, go on.
No, please.
I was going to say, when we were playing Masks, there's the Australian chapter has Yithians in it, and one of the groups that adopted the Yithian as like a sort of like team mascot sort of thing, and they kept on trying to get to do things, and eventually it started to do very odd things to it. So they tried this. There's a device in that chapter where you can actually like have a Yithian come into the body, and they actually changed the Yithian in this person's body to a different Yithian. So it started acting even more odd and more. It didn't understand what was going on, and it ended up caused them a lot of strife because they thought it was their friend still, and it was a completely different Yithian.
But I think also you don't necessarily have to have someone being possessed by a Yithian for everything to seem a bit odd. You've got also in Lovecraft the thing on the doorstep. So you've got someone who is possessed by a different human consciousness, admittedly a very old, ancient sorcerer who has been body hopping down through time. But it's a similar kind of thing where the personality and the mannerisms and so on of that person change. And it may not be a classic uncanny valley response because they're still very obviously human. It's just that they're not the right human. They still have your friend's face. They still have potentially their voice, although the accent and the inflection might change. But yeah, just the way they move and some of the things they come out with are a bit different now. And yeah, I mean, that I think is something that is absolutely terrifying. And that and the Yithian stuff always makes me think of, to some degree, of a very unfortunate real world thing, which is the Brouard delusion. Which is it's a very rare symptom of some psychotic illnesses, I think primarily schizophrenia, where you believe that someone or an individual or people around you have been replaced by simulacra of some description, that they could be robots, they could be monsters, they could be demons possessing the people you love, but whatever it is, that person you knew has been replaced. And it can lead to absolute tragedy. I think when you've got things like Thing on the Doorstep and The Shadow After Time, you are almost playing into that Brouard illusion thing, where it's have the people around me been replaced? Are they something else now? which again is treading uncomfortably into, the real horrors that some people experience.
Yeah, it's a bit like sort of the lizard people that sort of roll over the sort of thing. They're not really who you think they are. Sort of the they live sort of aspect of it. I mean, it's I've truly believe the people around you are not who you think they are. Would be very lonely and isolating thing. It would drive you to, yeah, you could do a lot with that probably. But sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say it's something I've very much tried to build up as a feeling of paranoia in some games I've run. I mean, in fact, one you played, Graeme, the Meat Trade.
Yeah.
That is very much part of that sort of feeling of, can I trust that anyone around me is still who I knew they were, and who they're pretending to be, and that increasing feeling of isolation as more and more people are replaced.
Yeah, I mean, even that, the people that you know are people, or people you're not really wanting to encourage or even like talk to that much because they're so damaged from the experience of it. That it sort of permeates into your own characters, and they become slightly sort of wary of everyone. Yeah, and then you have the sort of like the almost like the truth serum, the sort of eye cream, which sort of opens everyone's eyes. And it's like, is it opening your eyes, or is it just fucking with me even more in a different way? It's like you just don't know what to believe anymore. I mean, we could have blown up we could have done a lot of things which were just normal people in the way, and we just happened to be psychotic at the time, and unfortunately they just they're our butcher bill, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very interesting one, but humanity's a weird thing. It's like even eating a bacon sandwich wrongly can make the internet go wild and start to can really ruin you as a person, never mind anything else.
Oh, God.
It's interesting how sort of group kind of picks up on these small tells. It's almost like they find someone's playing a trick on them and they just don't like it, and it's like they have to point it out, have to make it seen, I suppose.
I just remembered a really good kind of incorporation, at least for myself. I'm not sure if it's the BBC Shadow of Innsmouth series, the audio drama.
Yeah.
But it's in one of those audio dramas where Shadow of Innsmouth is basically reproduced, and just the description of how the passenger basically feels, the driver looking at him, the other passengers on the bus, and like this, it was so clear to me in my head, and it created this like really weird feeling for myself, because I imagined to be the one of these passengers, and I have these people looking at me who are not human, but there's something weird about them, or then you come into the town, and I don't know, I think that's for me a very good take on the uncanny valley, especially in the Lovecraftian universe, where it's, I don't know, these deep ones infiltrating or living in this community, and the slow revelation and then escape out of the town. Just reminded me as we were talking about this a bit. I really enjoyed this just initial, I don't know, 15 minutes of Shadow of Innsmouth, where he starts to understand that something is weird here and everybody behaves a bit out of the ordinary. And it's just enough to make him kind of unsettled, I feel like. It's a very subtle...
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, but this is something that Lovecraft does in a number of his stories, and The Shadow of Innsmouth is the perfect example of it, where he does present this group of people as being wrong. The people of Innsmouth, that even the ones who still look human, have got a pallor to their skin, their texture's wrong, their eyes are a bit wrong, they smell funny, and stuff like that. All these little things that once you learn about Lovecraft as a person, you realize is rooted very much in his own personal bigotry and xenophobia, that a lot of the things that he's bringing into his descriptions of his humanoid monsters is stuff that he felt about actual real people. And that was a very uncomfortable revelation I had many years ago when I finally pieced that together, and I'm sure many other people have been through exactly the same thing, of realizing that what makes Lovecraft so effective at this kind of horror is his bigotry.
Yeah.
And what he's doing, which is something I'm sure much smarter and more educated people than myself have delved into, and he is sharing that experience of visceral xenophobia through metaphor, through these proxies, these humanoid monsters, and making that xenophobic fear accessible to people who do not share it. He's allowing us to get inside the minds of a frightened bigot and understand their fears, which isn't necessarily something that a lot of people would want to do. And I mean, I think this is why a lot of people don't like Lovecraft. Not just because he was a terrible person, but because he is bringing these fears into his stories. But I personally, it makes me very uncomfortable when I think about it. But at the same time, horror writers bring their fears into stories. They bring the things that upset them into stories and turn them into metaphor, turn them into more universal experiences. And the fact that Lovecraft is doing it here, I may not like what birthed it, what inspired him, but it does make for some damn effective horror.
Yeah, I think if you believe your own bullshit, it makes everything a lot more visceral, and he certainly did do that in a lot of ways. It's quite eye opening. It's very interesting because he's a person that you can actually read a lot of his letters, and you actually can get to know him, which is still astounding that people kept all these letters. So it is very telling looking at it through that lens. But yeah, definitely, I think it's a very common writer's trick, or not trick, but sort of way of doing things is write what really does hit home with you. And yeah, he does do it very well with the Uncanny Valley. Again, it must have been quite lonely for him. He was quite there's two sort of train of thought. People say he's quite affable and did have a lot of friends, and then some people say he's quite standoffish and was quite alone a lot of his life as well. These two different aspects. Sort of like when he moved to the city, he felt very lonely, sort of thing.
Yeah, I think the affable side is probably the true, at least certainly towards people he liked, his friends. All the people he corresponded with, who he visited and so on, who when they spoke about him in their memoirs and in correspondence, portrayed him as being a very outgoing, friendly, lively person, very very warm, very funny. And yeah, I mean, that side of him that you're talking about is what I think we saw when he went to New York City and lived there with Sonia Green, his wife, and was exposed to large numbers of people who weren't like him and freaked the hell out. And I mean, people are complicated. I think neither one of those conflicts with the other. I mean, they're two aspects of his own personality. I don't think one of them is true and one of them isn't. I think he was just a complicated man.
Yeah, and I suppose that what creates the stories that we like, I guess. At the end of the day.
I just like to read a comment or discussion that went on in the comments between Grant and Anthony. The eerie feeling of things that fall into the uncanny valley is that it doesn't seem like a justified response. It is a reaction distinct from justified fear or something that is a real threat, from which the reaction was obvious question is, what happened to instill that reaction into us? Was there a long-distance threat from something that appeared very nearly human but wasn't? So,
well, if you,
yeah, go ahead.
I mean, Freud touched on uncanny valley a bit in his time as well, didn't he?
Yeah,
he
he
always
did.
put it back to
1990.
childhood.
Well, he coined the phrase uncanny. Yeah.
Oh yeah, true. Yeah.
Well,
So
what
Zur Psychologie
was it?
des...
Unheimlich?
it was someone before him,
Unheimlichen.
wasn't it?
Zur Psychologie des Unheimlichen. Ugh.
Yeah, and he used to say it was like the childish notion of danger that's not your mother, sort of thing. The sort of the intruder into the household that you're not quite certain of as a child, which is like it's still there as a subconscious fear as an adult, even though you, as a rational adult, you sort of tend to try and dismiss it. It still has that underlying childish sort of notion that this is not quite what you remember. This is not quite home. It's not quite the mum and father sort of thing.
Yeah, and certainly in Lovecraftian horror and Lovecraftian gaming, I think that's something that you can really make use of, which is that it is such an innate response, such an innate fear response that is disconnected from any sense of actual threat, that keeping people off balance in that way, players and their characters, is a very powerful technique, because as we've been touching upon throughout this, not everything you encounter in Lovecraftian horror that triggers an uncanny valley response is necessarily hostile, is necessarily predatory. But some things that trigger that response absolutely are, and if you let your guard down, they will eat you or do worse. And it's a question of balancing that innate response and learning to, in the game, figure out when it's justified and when you're just being a frightened ape.
Yeah, and it's I guess that's quite a difficult thing to do a lot of the time when you're dealing with Lovecraftian games, sort of thing, because there's always the twist that's coming for you, I suppose. So you're always looking for it, I guess.
Yeah, but I mean, certainly when I use stuff like this in games, one thing I've become much more keen on in recent years is not having the entities of the mythos as being necessarily malevolent or predatory. I mean, they're alien, and that their very nature can make things dangerous for us. Their goals may not be our goals, and sometimes what they have planned is not to our benefit, but they're not evil, they're not monsters, well, I mean, they're not monstrous. And it is just a question of whether, when you encounter something that is not right, is not like us, whether that feeling of, oh yeah, this is a monster, I've got to be careful, is justified, whether you're just seeing something that something that is alien as being terrifying because it's alien. And that latter aspect of it, I think, is something that isn't explored enough in Call of Cthulhu. I like those moments where you are creeped out or freaked out or whatever by something that is wrong, that is alien, that is monstrous, but it might actually be entirely neutral or benevolent towards you. You just can't get over the fact that you're human and these are your responses to it.
When
go on.
No, please.
I was going to say, it's how successful you've been to putting that into your own scenarios. That's the question I was going to ask.
Occasionally, it works quite well. I think there's the temptation sometimes to put a sort of gotcha in there of, this thing that you thought was a monster isn't. But I think if you play it more subtly than that, Yeah, I don't necessarily want to give spoilers for particular scenarios, but sort of the classic thing of you go to a small town and the people there are weird and a bit wrong, and there's strange things happening in the woods and stuff like that, which I've used in too many scenarios, and
Yeah.
and I mean sometimes the things that are happening are an absolute threat to human life and human existence, and sometimes they may end up being almost beneficial in perverse ways to the player characters, but they may also present some fundamental challenge to what it means to be human. And you almost start getting into transhumanist territory with some of this stuff, where there is, and I think it's very heavily tied in with the Uncanny Valley response, where there is this very human desire to see the human form and human identity as being something that should not be changed or transformed or violated in any way, and changing on a fundamental basis what it means to be human is a terrible and monstrous act. But if at the same time, what might be being offered in certain situations in the mythos, I mean, you see this in The Whisper in Darkness, is something transcendent. It is an opportunity for immortality. It's an opportunity to transcend the limitations of human experience. And that might be a terrible and frightening thing, but is it necessarily a bad one? I mean, it might be, for the people involved, something that brings well, as I said, transcendence, some kind of great fulfillment to them.
Yeah, I've tried it a couple times to various degrees of success. One of them, my scenario Fever, is like you're on this sort of moving west with the 49ers to settle in California, and you can come across this sort of mycelial sort of network, which you can kind of, it's like a vast computer, and you can join it and become part of the collective of this sort of thing. But the whole reason to do that is sort of collecting knowledge so it can basically nuke the world and start over again. And it sort of like resets the world every so often, but always has this sort of archive of people that will grow back out to sort of like fill the world back out. And players react to it quite viscerally. A lot of them don't like the idea of doing that, or they take on the sort of very sort of like anti like transcendent role, and they want rid of it. They always see that one as the bad one. The thing is, the other side is Yig. Yig wants to control the civilization, so you can join with the Yig as well to destroy the mycelial sort of colony, and basically shackle humanity to the Yig's will, basically. But most people will see Yig as good, and the mycelial spore is bad because it's more human, I suppose. His people are very sort of like happy to help out any way they can, but they're the ones that are gutting people and searing stones into people and things like that. It's very odd that the Yeg is always what people tend to go.
But I suspect as well that if you change that scenario subtly and had it so that the mycelial network wasn't even bringing about some terrible end, that perhaps the threat is an external one, that humanity is facing eradication, and the mycelial network, just as some kind of archivist, is saving them, or at least saving the memory of humanity through this absorption, that people would have exactly the same reaction. It doesn't have to pose an existential threat to trigger that response. It just has to be violating what it means to be human.
Yeah, I think that's pretty true. It's been interesting watching people go through it and like realizing what's happening, because it's very like an aggressive reaction. Very few people have embraced that a lot as well, and it's like it's quite interesting because they can die and come back if they join that sort of side, because they can just be regrown from the mycelial, so their character can just walk back into the scene. But yeah, it's very interesting, I think, that sort of angle of the transcendency in the Uncanny Valley.
And I think it feeds into a lot of body horror as well. And I mean, this is certainly something I feel a lot more as I get older, and my body does not work in the ways that it used to when I was younger. I mean, things hurt, things don't work the way they did, things are failing, and it's a constant reminder that being human is fundamentally a bit shit, and my my relationship with body horror and this transhumanist side of things changes more with every passing year, where I find myself a lot less sympathetic to the idea that humanity, the human form, is something that should be protected from violation at any cost. I mean, honestly, the idea of some mythos form of transhumanism seems pretty fucking appealing to me now.
Well, that yeah, I mean, get into a bit of science fiction here. You could look at what was the newer Alien films, the sort of Chart of the Gods sort of thing. With Prometheus, that was it. Sort of, he was dying and wanting to preserve himself, so he was looking for that sort of extension of life, and that's something you could probably do with that. But there's also Blade Runner. It's like there's a lot of uncanny valley with that, with all the sort of androids, and playing that was actually very interesting. That you actually played it, Scott.
Electric Dreams, yeah, I loved it.
Yeah, it's a great scenario, and I didn't expect it to be good or to be that good, because it asks a lot of questions about these characters which aren't human, and are they human, sort of thing. And there's the dilemma posed at the end is something which leaves the players a little bit scratching their heads. What do they do? Because there's no, well, there is a good answer, I suppose, but not everyone's going to agree what that is.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly remember when I played that. At some point, I engineered. I was playing a human Blade Runner in it, and I engineered the murder of a number of replicants by basically pitting them against anti-replicant activists and sort of setting up a conflict situation where I knew it would turn to violence, and I'd get as many people that I didn't want there anymore to kill each other as possible.
Lovely, Scott, lovely.
I mean, and at the end of it, it was just sort of sitting back with the other players and sort of, hang on, I just did a hate crime, didn't I?
Yeah.
Fuck.
Yeah, it's got some great characters in it, and I think that's pretty compelling as well. The fact you get to play them as players as well, so you're sort of pitting each other against each other, is that sort of like angst amongst the group. What's going to happen if you turn on each other? Yeah, it's pretty an interesting one. It's probably a standout for last year, that one.
Yeah, I know this is drifting away from the main topic, but I just sort of agree with that and say that Blade Runner and that scenario in particular completely surprised me. When I heard that someone was doing a licensed Blade Runner RPG, I thought, this is a terrible property for doing a game. It's very focused on the stories that were told in the book and the films, and I can't see it being fun to roleplay. And that scenario changed my mind completely. It's one of the best written scenarios I've ever played.
I agree. It's I pestered Cup so hard to get that done on 8 Slade, so I'm glad for it. But yeah, it's robots in the Uncanny Valley, I think, are probably going to be about for the next decade or so before they sort of perfect it, sort of thing. And you get that sort of fusion of people, and you get that sort of like more of a nuanced feel about it.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is something that we're encountering more and more in daily life. It's moved out of science fiction and horror, and is just something that we're dealing with as AI is growing more and more in popularity. Before we started recording, we were having a little discussion about this, and I was telling the others about something I can't remember if it was an article I read or a video I saw, where they were talking about a voice chatbot that had been developed that was designed to answer customer queries. And the fact they trained it on human voice data and were trying to make it sound as human as possible to try to put people at their ease. And one of the things they found was that people were more comfortable if it left all sorts of verbal tics in there that people have, like filler words and was stumbling over words, people repeating words like stammers, stuff like that. And, these very human flaws, as long as it mimicked those, then people would accept it as human. But if it spoke absolutely perfectly, then it would trigger some kind of alarm response. And yeah, that's kind of a weird thing to accept, isn't it?
God doesn't draw in straight lines, basically. Everything's different and a little bit lumpy, I guess. Yeah, I think it's the human eye just doesn't like these sort of very like neat symmetry. When I'm sculpting, you should never mirror things completely. You should always add that sort of asymmetric style to faces and things like that. And it's yeah, people just don't like seeing themselves like mirrored and stuff like that. And there's the famous Tom Cruise picture where he's got the middle tooth when someone sort of mirrored him
Oh,
over,
yes.
and
Yes.
he's like that uncanny valley. It's I don't know where that came from, but it's very very famous. And it's like people just feel it's really strange and odd, even though it's just a meme that someone's sort of created. Yeah, it's like people like sort of like chaos in things and like slight perfections and flaws. The more you get to perfection, the more people like will rebel against it. So,
But I think some of the things that trigger that uncanny valley response in Lovecraftian horror also are on the other side of that divide. So I'm thinking about, say, Pickman's model and A Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath. You have the character of Pickman, who is this person, but he is in the process of transforming into a ghoul. And the idea that you've got these people who are still basically human, and I guess this applies to the Shadow of Rinsmouth as well, but are beginning to show non-human traits. They in the case of the ghouls and Pickman and so on, that there's perhaps a slightly predatory look to him. There's something about the way his eyes reflect the light. There's something about his teeth just looking a bit too sharp and stuff like that. That it's not that it's too perfect. It's almost too imperfect. It's too inhuman. There's something almost animalistic about it.
do you think there's a human valley that the humans have to reside in? There's like go too far one way or the other. You become something else, transcend or devolve into this bestial form. I think that's more to do with disease and people having sort of reservations about that sort of like animalistic side. It's not society, I guess, in quotes, or it's they don't want to be part of that sort of like yeah, they sort of like outside the tribe, sort of devolving into something else or becoming.
Oh no, sorry.
No, it's anyway.
Well, and also that is triggering responses in us that tell us that this is a predator. There's characteristics we've learned to associate with predatory animals that we're now seeing in a human.
Yeah, I suppose so, yeah.
I was just wondering, can you expand maybe the uncanny phenomena to the bigger picture of cosmic fear and horror or threat as a cosmic entity? Or is it much more significant when it's minimalistic or human-like in that aspect?
I'd say it's a human condition. It's sort of like really part of us, that sort of thing. It's so sort of like intertwined with how we feel about the people around us. I don't think you could probably put it on a cosmic level, really. It's like a very personal horror. I think an interesting thing would to be looking at is like what one person's uncanny valley to the next person's uncanny valley. Are they different? How different are they? To see if it's like something that can change or it's completely, it syncs up with everyone. It's like just a universal species trait that we have. If it can be broken, sort of thing. But the next generation will, as you were saying, probably will find out because they're growing up with AI. They're growing up with all these things. If they still reject the sort of uncanny valley, it'll be interesting to see. But if you get past it and into things looking real, proper real like humans, and that sort of Blade Runner aspect, then you're past it, and it's almost a different thing altogether. So
But I also think part of what you were getting at there, David, is because we tend to lump a bunch of different things in together into what we call Lovecraftian horror. Because Lovecraft, yes, I mean, the cosmic horror is a big part of his writing. He pretty much coined the term cosmic horror. And there's certainly this fear of the unknown, this fear of forces greater than ourselves, this fear of the things that make us insignificant. But I'd say that's in many ways the polar opposite of the kind of fear we're talking about here, because that is something that is scary because it is so divorced from humanity. It is the very opposite of us. But there are also all these elements in his stories, like Pickman's Model and The Shadow of Rinsmith and The Shadow Out of Time, where you have these slight changes to what it means to be human that reflect a very different fear. The fact that he brings them together in a lot of cases and links them, I think, is what creates Lovecraftian horror. But they're, in my opinion at least, polar opposites.
I suppose you could say it's the cosmic horror trying to convince you it's your friend by wearing your skin. In a lot of ways, it's the amalgamation of the sort of crossover sort of between the two.
I mean, you certainly had that in Lovecraft himself with Nyarlathotep. And
Yeah.
I mean, when he appears in person in the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, then there's nothing necessarily uncanny about his presentation there. He appears as a very kind of attractive youth who is glib and charming and apparently completely human. But if that is Nyarlathotep that Wilmarth meets in the guise of Henry later on, that clearly is a much more inhuman version of him that does trigger these responses. And so, that is very much the cosmic pouring itself into the human guise and perhaps getting it slightly wrong.
Yeah, that's sort of back to that Shoggoth Lord sort of idea. They're just trying to get along, I guess.
Okay. Just a reminder to those watching live, if you have any questions or interesting nudges of what we should talk about, please let us know, because we'll slowly start, I think, to wrap up here. I think what I want to kind of go into a bit, because we slowly progress from like early times to modern days, do you see like more application of uncanny valley in modern day scenarios? For example, if you write them, the use thereof, or are there maybe suggestions you could give for writing scenarios in 1920s or earlier times where it's a bit different? Are there differences?
I don't think they're that different. If my own personal view is like, You look at back history, people have been trying to replicate humans for a very long time. Going back to like paintings, even it's like people have been trying to capture what it is to be human and produce their own human, I guess, in some sort of fashion. If you go to paintings, it's like when you have that white dot in that eye, the apple of the eye. Without that white dot,
Mm.
it's like you have this soulless form. It could be a perfect romanticism painting, um, and if it's missing that dot on the eye, that's sort of just the sort of the piece of life that you give it by doing that. That will just look dead inside. It's a
Mm.
very odd sensation, and the same thing goes for wax and wax models and interpretations. I've got like quite a lot of old autonomy like encyclopedias that are just wax model after wax model after wax model of humans and parts of humans, and they all look very surreal, sort of laid out on a table. All these different heads that are just like looking up at you. They look almost perfect. There's just something not right about them. They even have like real hair that's been pushed into them. It's just there's something about the eyes. There's something about the mouth might just be a little bit off. That will always do it for you, and that translates all the way up to robots. You're still doing the same thing. You're still making that facsimile of human, and it can be perfect. But if it lacks that, it's almost like saying it lacks a soul. It's like you're trying to go back to
Mm.
that Blade Runner thing. If it lacks the soul, and it's an innately human thing to notice, like it just puts your heckles up. You know, it's almost like a sixth sense, I suppose.
Sorry, just as an aside, you reminded me when you were talking about the disconnected bits of wax figures of one of the creepiest pictures I've ever seen. I can't remember the source video. I mean, I think it was taken like 100 years ago or more, which was just the aftermath of a fire in a wax museum.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, the bodies weren't completely destroyed. They were just kind of warped and lying broken across the ground and slightly melted. And yeah, it's there. Yeah, I don't know if that's technically an uncanny valley response. It's very close, but you look at that and oh dear God, it sets off alarms.
Yeah, I've had friends that worked in the Madame Tussauds before, and they don't actually. What they should be doing, really, if they wanted an accurate picture of someone's like face, they should just be taking a mask of the face, like just take a mold of the face, and that'd be done. It'd be the easiest thing to do, but they never do that. They measure the face in its entirety and replicate it from um, that sort of like measurements instead of taking that death mask. And it's I find that very interesting because originally it was set up with death masks in mind.
Mm.
It was like death mask smuggled out of like France that was used to set up the museum. But they eventually changed over to doing it all by artisan, like just crafting, rather than doing the death mask because it's. I think again it comes back to the uncanny valley. It looks
Mm.
realer, and if you're doing it with mistakes, them small mistakes that are just more human.
And I wonder as well whether it's because just the the human face changes in death. If you've ever seen someone you've known in life after they've died, I mean, it's still the same person. You can recognize them, but without the animating force in the muscles in the face and the eyes sinking a bit. And, it's very obviously it looks dead. It's not the same face anymore. And I imagine with a death mask, you're capturing that, that sunken, that slack version of the face. And I mean, even barring the semi-perfection of it, you'd probably be getting those same subconscious signifiers that, oh, hang on, I'm looking at a corpse.
Yeah, but it's more of a modern thing that they do because they're not killing Kylie Minogue when she comes into
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
the studio. It's like, she's not like off the wagon. Yeah, so they are just like just taking calipers and taking all the sizes and stuff. But yeah, I think probably moving away from the death mask is probably the reason they did that initially. But they could take a live mask, a live
Mm.
mold, that's something they could do. But again, it looks too lifeless.
But I suppose that going back to David's question, I don't necessarily see huge differences in how I'd use it in a modern scenario and a 1920s scenario, because technology may change, but people fundamentally don't. The responses that we're talking about, the triggers that we're talking about here, are the same now, I'd say, as they were in the 1920s. So, that aspect of it, no, I wouldn't necessarily consider that in terms of the period. Where the period comes in is very much with the technology that's available. And yes, all the advances with AI and robotics and so on are things that I think you could definitely bring into modern Call of Cthulhu scenarios. I think it'd be very easy to do it badly. And the problem with incorporating stuff like that into games is it becomes dated very quickly. I've joked about this before. The Cthulhu Now setting that Chaos published in the 1990s is now a period setting. It's Cthulhu Then. Their attempt to be cutting edge has captured a very specific point in technological history, that early 90s pre-internet but burgeoning electronic communication era, which is absolutely fascinating and is great for a period setting. But I think if you were to try to write a scenario now that drew upon advances in AI and I keep thinking about the fact that AI researchers refer to the sort of inhuman black box behind all these chat responses that you get in AI systems as a shoggoth, because they consider it to be something unknowable, this construct that is evolved and has been put together. I think if you tried to capture all that stuff in a modern scenario, even within 2 years, it would probably be borderline unplayable, because things will have moved on so quickly that it's almost like it's triggering an uncanny valley response of its own, in that you're playing this and it's, hang on, this isn't like what the world is. It's all different now. So I wouldn't even try. I wouldn't even try to do that.
Okay, fair point. Good. I think, unless there's any topics that you might want to raise or end upon, maybe some concluding remarks on maybe aspects of Uncanny Valley that you'd like to give keepers or people who want to incorporate that effect into their games. If you have any suggestions, or if you have any general suggestion of what to read, what to devour in media that might give some inspiration in that aspect, that might be interesting. Yeah. Scott? Graeme?
Yeah. Well, media to consume, like Coraline is quite a sort of like an interesting one to look at. It's like people kind of overlook it a lot for this sort of thing, but I think it's Neil Gaiman does like his Uncanny Valley quite a bit, and I think the story before that sort of thing is quite interesting. There's things like Dark City as well you could look at. Which is a Truman Show. Maybe Total Recall as well, and Oz. What was who did Oz again? I can't remember.
Jordan Peele.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, I think that one probably hits least for me. It was a little bit too on the nose, but it's still a pretty good film. Using it in scenarios and stuff. Yeah, just to make sure you're on the right side of what you want to do. Try not to go down too humanistic, sort of that problematic area. I always add that sort of like piece of wonder, which makes it horror, instead of sort of mixed in with the humanity, to make players realize that this is not of this world, or this is slightly different in that way, and make sure it's sort of mixed in with a lot of sort of humanity, I guess, like bring that human element to something if it is monstrous on the inside as well.
Mm. As far as media goes, I don't think you can go wrong with classics like The Thing and Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where you have aliens who are pretending to be human and getting it right to various degrees. And yeah, I think that can perhaps inform some of the portrayals you put into your games. And as far as a bit of advice for keepers is concerned, yeah, I'll just echo what Graeme said there. I think, yeah, you have to give some thought into what you're doing here and why you're doing it. Because, yes, it is absolutely cool and valid, I think, to use these elements to create a sense of unease and creepiness and paranoia amongst the players. But at the same time, you might want to take a completely different tack and just start presenting challenges to the players' conceptions of just what it means to be human and whether that's really such a good thing.
Fantastic. I think on this beautiful remark, we can say thank you all viewers, and hope you learned something. I certainly did, or got inspired, let's put it this way. And yeah, thank you very much, Scott Dorward and Graham Patrick, for this enticing discussion on the second day of A Weekend with Good Friends. And there are many more panels to come, so stay tuned and enjoy the show.
Thanks
Bye,
for having me.
everyone.
Yeah, thank you very much.